Good evening. Let's get the audience going. Good evening. Excellent. Remember, we will have Q&A later, and we certainly expect many Simon's Rocker questions to our speaker, who, having attended Simon's Rock, is familiar with such things. Anyway, it's great to see you, and I'm John Weinstein, Provost and Vice President, and it is very exciting to have big in-person events with people coming to campus and things we haven't been able to do so much, so let's give ourselves a round of applause for having to do that. It's also just so exciting to be able to then welcome alums back to campus as they move on and become authors and other things. And so we will be having that. But first, to introduce our speaker, I'm going to introduce the introducer. And I'm very excited to introduce Kellyanne McGuire, who is our Director of Senior Thesis and Outreach Librarian. And she will be telling you about Molly McCully Brown, who's bringing a new voice into our continuing series of Book One, where we look at different voices and what they bring. And very excited to have Kellyanne introduce Molly. So Kellyanne.
And Molly's here as well. So good to see your face, man. So there is a line in the poem Numb by award-winning poet and Simon's Rock alumna Molly McCully Brown in her collection, The Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded. It goes like this, quote, "Yes, I am still alive. I am still a body in the world," end quote. As a person with a disability, I think about what it means to be a body in the world, what spaces I have access to and which I don't, where I am safe and where there are threats, how it feels to be at odds with my body, but also how grateful I am for what it offers me. This tension between the limitations of the body and the desire to not be defined by it, alongside the awareness and gratitude that this experience makes us who we are, is a central theme throughout Molly's work. Her books, poems, essays, and articles explore what it is like to be, quote, tied to a huge population of people who lived before, end quote, reminding those of us with disabilities that although we may feel alone at times, we are not. I first met Molly 5 years ago, when she did a reading at Simon's Rock, when this book was first published. I had no idea what to expect, and couldn't have known then how much of an impact she and her writing would have on my life. Hosting Molly for an informal open forum in the library was the first time I saw a young professional like me with a visible disability. She was literally the first person who modeled for me how to calmly, confidently, and clearly ask for the accommodations I needed with no hint of an apology. She was the first person I heard speak about the reality of being a young female person with a disability teaching in a classroom, and how the intersection of these three identities affected her work for the better, but also opened her up to forms of disrespect and ableism that could be challenging to navigate. She spoke so matter-of-factly about a reality that for me was still very emotionally fraught. She articulated things that I was experiencing, but hadn't yet put into coherent thoughts or words, because I was so busy building a life and career despite my disability, instead of alongside it. She made me realize that I don't need to ignore my disability to be taken seriously, and that it's precisely because of my experiences that I'm able to show up as the person I am, the librarian I am, the teacher, the colleague, the friend that I am. It is not an exaggeration to say that meeting Molly changed my life. I pre-ordered her second book, Places I've Taken My Body, as soon as I knew it existed. I waited months for my copy to arrive, and when it did, at the height of the pandemic, I gulped it down in one sitting, as if quenching a thirst I didn't know that I had. In her collection of essays, she writes about moving through spaces, access and limitations, and books that have influenced her writing and thought. The rockers among you will notice references to Seminar, at least one of these books you'll read this upcoming year. While Places I've Taken My Body explores what it means to be both a part of and apart from this world that so often struggles to accommodate us, her third book, In the Field Between Us, is about kinship. It is a series of epistolary poems between Molly and Suzanne Nevison that uses precise and beautiful language to meditate on this body, deconstructed and reconstructed by the medical industry, the body in relation to nature, and the joy and solace found in a friendship with someone who truly gets it. It is raw, moving, and relatable. So why am I telling you about my experiences and why Molly's work is so meaningful for me? I want you to understand how important it is that she is our book one speaker. I want you to know how special and rare it is to have two young women who work in academia with visible physical disabilities on the stage before you. 20% of the world's population, that's 1 in 5 people in this room, experience disability. And yet it's not something that we talk about or see in the culture at large. Disability is a thread that weaves through every other identity, and it is integral to the human experience. And yet we avoid it or only acknowledge it with hushed tones. Our country in general, and academia in particular, have a long track record of discrimination and exclusion. In addition to institutions like the Virginia State Colony, where people were locked away without their consent, so-called ugly laws were in effect from the mid-1800s through the 1970s. These made it a crime for people with disabilities to be seen in public. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which grants access to physical spaces as well as services, became a law during our lifetime. Academia privileges the intellect and the mind, and performing a certain way is core to the institution. This system of rigor often weeds out those deemed not smart enough or not physically capable enough to handle the workload, schedule, and other requirements. And this in and of itself is an insidious and often unacknowledged form of ableism. We are two women with disabilities working in academia, and we are by far the exception, not the norm. Writers like Molly show people like me that we are not alone, and that our stories matter. In Virginia State Colony, she gives voices to the ghosts of the past, and there was no one better equipped to create art out of such heart-wrenching history than someone sensitive to the realities of being in a body at the mercy of others. One may think that the topics covered in this book are too dark to revisit, that our history is in our past, or that the stories explored here are no longer relevant. And I would like to offer an alternative perspective. The topics of bodily integrity and autonomy, the right of the state, institutions, and individuals to make decisions over others' lives, and the idea that the way one's minds and bodies function determines their worthiness or value to society are more relevant and important than ever. I am telling you all this because I want you to know that the fact that the two of us are on stage before you matters. As Molly writes in Places I've Taken My Body, quote, "I want a different, better world than the one I came of age in. Each child with a disability will always know too early the dictionary of defects and treatments essential to her life, but I want for them all to have, too, another language with which to talk about their bodies and their lives, one of pride and complexity, intimacy and particularity, survival and triumph," end quote. Molly has offered me that language, and I have found such pride through her writing, and my hope is that you will all find something of value in it as well. The themes of Virginia State Colony are dark, but the experiences of the people were real, and they deserve to be acknowledged. Molly's writing hums with tenderness, sorrow, and clarity, and it is her lived reality that brings such empathy, gentleness, and grace to this history, the echoes of which reverberate through the decades and still haunt many of us today. But we are still alive. We are still bodies in the world. I am so incredibly grateful, humble, proud, and excited to invite Molly McCully Brown back to Simon's Rock as our book one speaker.
Thank you all, and thank you, Kelly, for that incredibly generous introduction. I feel like maybe I don't need to give a talk now. I feel like that was it. It's just so moving to hear all of that and to share the stage with you. And it's incredibly moving to be back. I spent a few minutes before this evening driving around campus with Brendan Matthews, just with the window rolled down, exclaiming about things that existed here when I was 16 and 17, and it's really, I'm remembering how big this room felt, and how important the people who were on it felt to me when I was a student. I'm here to tell you I am not important. But it's really, really, really moving to be sitting on this stage and talking to all of you. I'm going to start by reading the first poem from this collection, which is called the Central Virginia Training Center, formerly the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded. Whatever it is, home or hospital, graveyard or asylum, government facility or great tract of land slowly seeding itself back to dust, its church is a low-slung brick box with a single window, a white piece of plywood labeled chapel, and a locked door. Whatever it is, my mother and I ride along its red roads in February with the windows down. This place looks lived in. That one has stiff, gray curtains in the window, a roof caving in. We see a small group moving in the channel between one building and the next, bowing in an absent wind. He is in a wheelchair. She is stumbling, pushing a pram from decades ago, coal black and wrong. There is no way it holds a baby. Behind them, a few more shuffling bodies in coats. I am my own kind of damage there, looking out the right-hand window, spastic, palsied, and off balance. I'm taking crooked notes about this place. It is the land where he is buried, the place she spent her whole life, the room where they made it impossible for her to have children. It is the colony where he did not learn to read, but did paint every single slat of fence you see that shade of yellow. The place she didn't want to leave when she finally could, because she'd lived there 50 years and couldn't drive a car or remember the outside or trust anyone to touch her gently. And by some accident of luck or grace, some window less than half a century wide, it is my backyard, but not what happened to my body. Eventually, I'm going to talk to you about this book. I'm going to talk to you about the education that I got at Simon Rock and the education that you are all in the midst of. We're just starting out on. But first, I'm going to tell a story that will probably upset all the professors and administrators in this room and several of your parents. I'm going to tell you about a time in the winter of my freshman year here at the Rock where I broke into a house. So, as many of you likely know, right by campus there's a lake called Mansfield Lake, and you can walk around it. And in the winter of my freshman year, when we had lots of reading and it was very cold and we were just desperate to get away and get outside, I had a friend who I used to walk that loop with. Every day. Walk is actually not the right term. She walked. I got around campus on a really giant, really loud blue tricycle that made a lot of noise everywhere I went. It was kind of awesome. I'm a little sorry that I don't still have it. But we would do this loop around the lake probably 3 times a week. And eventually we started going up to the top of this hill right off campus, and we realized that the house where we would always stop and turn around, it was in this sort of weird shadow state between use and abandonment, and we could never figure out if anyone actually lived there or not. Sometimes we thought we noted changes in the debris on the front lawn, but we never saw any cars or any certain sign of life. And one day, we were up at the top of the hill, and I honestly can't remember which one of us said it, but one of us was like, we should go inside. We should see if we can go inside. My friend Mary climbed through a window that was open and went around and unlocked the door so that I could come inside. And it was clearly people, whoever lived there, had either moved out and left things behind or were in the process of moving out. It was full of a couple of cardboard boxes with some really random things in them. a colander with a little yellow legal pad for taking notes, some pens, a couple of framed photographs in really old-fashioned silver frames. And then in the middle of the room, there was this grand piano that either hadn't been moved out yet or couldn't be moved out. Mary started to play the piano, and I just sort of looked through these boxes, and one half of my brain was like, the police are gonna come and we're gonna get arrested. But the other half of my brain was really struck by and moved by what it was like to encounter just the sort of leftover material details of someone's life and construct an imagination of them from those details, which were evocative in their specificity and in their randomness and in their strangeness. And it was really my first encounter with the power of the intersection between information and the archive and what's left behind and imagination. And that is really the thing that led to this book. And so I want to be very clear that I'm not advocating breaking into a house. Don't do it. Make better decisions than I made when I was 17. But I am advocating paying attention to the experiences in your life that feel like they come out of nowhere. Like they're a little random. Like they're not necessarily tied to your classes or who you think you're going to be or what you think you're interested in. Because it's often those experiences, the ones where you sort of feel like you're watching yourself from a little outside of your body, that become, in ways that surprise you, the most foundational ones. The Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded was a real place. And in the early to mid 1900s, it was one of the major hubs of the American eugenics movement. And what that means is that from about 1920 to about 1955, thousands of people who either had or were perceived to have a variety of physical and intellectual disabilities were forcibly committed and forcibly sterilized there. Not only without their consent, but often without their knowledge. They were told that they were being given appendectomies and were sterilized instead. This man in the photograph back here is a man named Albert Priddy. He was the very first superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded. He was also a known eugenicist. And he is responsible for starting the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell, which was the Supreme Court case that would make eugenic sterilization legal in the United States. It is a law which, while we don't draw on it anymore, has never been officially overturned. This is Carrie Buck and Emma Buck. Emma is Carrie's mother. Carrie Buck was a patient at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded, as was her mother, Emma, and her infant daughter, Vivian. Albert Priddy thought that these three women, all of whom were classified as imbeciles, really for no other reason than that they were poor and uneducated and had children out of wedlock, would be the perfect test case for eugenic sterilization in the United States. He thought one generation of imbeciles wouldn't be especially persuasive. Two generations of imbeciles may be a little more persuasive, but three generations of imbecilic women, incredible. This case eventually went to the Supreme Court case of the United States, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes delivered a ruling in which he said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that ruling made possible the forced sterilizations of thousands and thousands and thousands of people, largely women, but people of both genders. And it's a ruling that still has ramifications today. I grew up just a handful of miles from the site of the former Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded, which is rare among institutions where mass sterilizations happen, because until April of 2020, it remained a functioning residential facility for children and adults with really serious disabilities. But like a lot of places in the American South, it was built on an enormous amount of land. And so this amazing thing happened when the facilities began to fall into disrepair, which is that instead of rehabbing the original buildings or knocking them down, they just built new buildings beside them on all the available land. And so this place is this incredible palimpsest, this combination of a functioning medical facility and a ghost town, a repository for this terrible history. When I was growing up, I knew very little about the colony. I knew vaguely that it had this complicated history tangled up with Appalachia and the Great Depression, but that's about it. I never actually made a trip to the colony until the year after I graduated from Simon's Rock. I did my first 2 years of school here, and then I transferred to Stanford in California. And the summer before I was going to move to California, I was home and taking a theology class at a university in Virginia about an hour north of my hometown. And I decided that I was going to take a friend on a tour of my sort of rural southern hometown, and that it was going to be funny. She needed a distraction. She was having a hard time. And it was just going to be a chance to share with her the particularities of the landscape that I loved. And so we put her dog in her truck, and we drove down from Charlottesville to Amherst, the little town where I grew up. And then we were going to drive over the mountains into Bedford. Someone had built a theme park called Holy Land USA there, featuring homemade versions of all the Stations of the Cross, and we thought it would be really funny, so we were going to go look at it. But on the way, we decided to pull through the gates at Colony Road and stop there. And take a look, and it's telling that I can't remember now why we decided to stop. Maybe because I'd never been there, maybe just because her dog needed to pee. But we got out, and I read that sign that you guys saw in the very first slide, and we walked around all these buildings and into the colony cemetery, which I would later learn was mostly artifice. The colony has a vast cemetery. There are all of these gravestones with names and numbers on them, but almost no one is buried underneath a headstone. They're all buried in a mass grave in the field nearby. And there was a sign in the cemetery that talked just a very little bit about some of the eugenic sterilizations that had happened there. And then it had a quote in the section of the cemetery that was mostly the gravestones of children, and it said, as seedlings of God, we barely bloomed on earth, we fully flower in heaven. I'm going to make it come back, if I can. Jen, can you make it come back? We'll see. It's not a big deal. She'll figure it out. I remember feeling just enraged by this quote. And also sort of sick to my stomach that I hadn't known anything about the history of this place. And feeling then my own body, my legs contracting underneath me, my balance failing, and realizing that if I had been born in the same part of the world that I was from, that I loved, this landscape, this town that meant the world to me, and had always felt like home. If I'd been born in that same part of the world, even 50 years earlier, I would probably have been a prime candidate to be a colony patient. And I went home that day and I did some research, and I discovered the things about Buck v. Bell and Carrie Buck and the history of the colony that I shared with all of you. And I started a file on my computer as 19. And it would take me another 2 years to feel ready to come back to that file and to know what I was going to do with it. But ever since that day, I would just go back to it occasionally, look up something else online, put another piece of information in there, and then close it out. Turn away, because I didn't know what to do with it yet. Remember what I said about those experiences in your life that you don't know are going to be transformational, are going to shape your whole life? I'm going to read 3 more poems that are from the first section of the book. So that prologue poem that I read to you is one of the only poems in the book that's set in the present day. Most of the poems in the book are set in the voices of imagined patients and staff in the colony in the 1930s at the height of the sterilization movement. These 3 poems come from the first section of the book, which is called In the Dormitory, Fall 1935. Grand mal seizure. There's however it is you call, and there's whatever it is you're calling to. July, I sew my own dress from calico and lace. August, they take it off me in the colony, traded in for standard issue Virginia cotton. Not much room for my body in the heavy slip. Maybe that's the idea. For a while, the abandoning was rare, and then it was not, and would never be again. Imagine you are an animal in your own throat. The dormitory has a pitched, dark roof and a high porch. We are not allowed outside. Instead, we go to the window and make a game of racing dogwood blossoms knocked down by the wind. Choose your flower as it falls and see whose is the first to hit the clay. I beat the crippled girl every day for a week. The trick is to pick the smaller petals. Most nights, they knock the bedsheet in my mouth so I will not bite my tongue. Lay out on the pine floor, rattle your own bones back to the center of the world. In the beds, the smell of kerosene and lye. The girls wake themselves one after another. Spasms, whimper, whine. Outside, cicadas. In the distance, the big house lights. Another truck comes loud up the road, bearing another girl. There is whatever it is you're calling to. There is however it is you call. Labor. If you have the body for it, you're bound for the fields to pick strawberries and coax the milk from cows, or hired out to make baking powder biscuits and gravy, to sweep floors and wash and fold a stranger's clothes. You come back on a truck after sunset, raw and ragged, covered in flour, tobacco, or clay. You come back bone-tired and bruised, burned, dead out, and ready to be shut away. You sleep. I know all this from stories. I do not have the body for it. I do not go to the fields or the barns or the parlors of other folks' houses. I wake at sunrise when they wake the rest, lie in bed till somebody hauls me out and puts me by the window. Lord, I know, to want to work's a foolish thing to those who've got a body built for working. I was as close to born here as you can get, brought twisted and mewling to the gates and left. Since then, I am one long echo of somebody else's life. Every understanding that I have is scrap, is shard, is secondhand. Distance, the space between the porch railing and the rise of the Blue Ridge. Water, what comes from a bucket to my body on Sundays, what I open my mouth for morning and night. Sex, the days the girls come back smelling of whiskey, snuff, and sweat, and something sharp. No more. This is called Every Other Thing I See is a Ghost. Whatever it is you were born to do, sweetheart, there's no doing it here. Make peace with small labors. Your own hand drawing a needle through a torn sheet, your elbow bending as you soak clothes in the washroom downstairs. The storm that tears the azaleas apart along the road outside, that's it for beauty. Or also there's the way at night the girls in nearby beds teach one another to cuss. Whisper, God damn it, you bastard. Sigh, God damn it all to hell. You know, before they brought me here, I'd never seen a ghost or anything that wasn't really there. I'd never heard a voice half asleep in the blackness and had to wonder whether or not it belonged to a body. But after the swearing, someone has been singing me hymns from home. Canaan's land, the spirit shall return, traveling on. In the daylight, no one ever sings. Sometimes in the doorway, I think I see a hen trailing away outside, but there's nowhere to leave to, and nobody, sweetheart, nobody has a dress that long, or lace. That you can tell from those poems is they're not in my voice, and they're not about my own experience. And I think one of the reasons it took me such a long time to come back to that file on my computer, to come back to the project, is I knew it couldn't be a book about me. That ultimately, while I felt this kind of geographical proximity, the sense that this was the history from which my life had emerged, it wasn't my experience. And I had a lot of questions and a lot of anxiety about how I might approach telling this story, how I might approach writing those poems, if it was even a story that it was my right to tell. But I knew that to answer any of those questions, I was going to have to go back to what information did exist about that place, about that time, about that history. I'm going to see if I can get it to turn back on. They're rebooting it? Okay. I think it shut off, but we'll see. We'll give it a minute. If it doesn't come back on, the photos that I was going to show you, I'll talk about, and I'll send them forward for you guys to maybe look at a future date. And so the first thing I did when I finally decided I have got to figure out how to write this book, if it's a book I can even write, is I made use of a skill that I had developed with Science Rock, which is that I just went looking for answers in research and in the archive. And I found an amazing resource called the Image Archive on the American Eugenics Movement. And that is a digital repository of newspaper clippings and forms and photographs and medical records that are all about the proliferation of eugenics in the United States. And what I found there was remarkable. It's back! Hey! Fabulous.
Thank you, nice guys.
Great. Thank you. One of the things I found, for instance, were these photographs taped to pages with what at the time were medical diagnoses. These were propaganda postcards used by eugenicists to talk about why eugenic sterilization needed to happen. If we don't sterilize these defective populations, if we don't institutionalize them and shut these away, your children will have muscular atrophy and look like this. Your children will have spastic idiocy and look like this. It's worth noting that my contemporary diagnosis is moderate spastic diplegia. And I see echoes of a lot of my high muscle tone and the way that I hold my body in that photo. Mongolian idiocy. The term that we use now for people who have this kind of condition and this lived reality is Down syndrome. Cretinism, feeble-mindedness. There are two photographs there because one of the things that eugenicist doctors wanted you to notice was the shape of the skull. The other things that existed were newspaper articles, sterilizations of defectives, and forms. This is the form that they would have used at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feebleminded when they sterilized someone. And it might look familiar to some of you who've experienced poems in the book. And viewing this archive taught me a lot. Mostly what it taught me is the language that proliferated at the time. The ways of talking and thinking about disability and defect and repair. And I want to read you guys one poem that arose directly out of these propaganda postcards. It's called The Dictionary of Hereditary Defects. And it begins with an epigraph that comes from one of these newspaper articles. The comparison of idiots and normal children must almost be a comparison between two separate species. It's shocking, really, how many ways a being can go wrong before they're even born into the world. Cretinism, you are caught between human and animal, heavy and flat-faced. You have hoofs for hands, a cow's wide tongue. Epilepsy, you are destroying yourself from the inside out. Feeble-mindedness, I could shout into the cavern of your mouth and hear my own words echo back off the high walls of your head over all the blank space of your brain. This is the most useful noise that you will ever make. Idiocy. You cannot even reproduce my echo. You are living, yet already your body has started to decay. It knows you are not for this world. You go limp or spastic, turn to stone or slime. At home, I drown the smallest kitten in the litter. I hold its head under water for a minute, feel its heart stop with my thumb. It's done. You are not for this world. It would be cruel to let you replicate yourself and make another creature, fated to crawl around feeble and stunted, yowling for absent milk. You'll notice that poem is in the voice of a colony staff member, a colony doctor. And it highlights one of the problems with this record, which is that it's entirely full of the perspective of eugenicists, the people who were empowered. And nowhere in it Is there the perspective of the people who were sterilized, the people who were institutionalized, the people who had violence perpetrated against them? Because that's the difficult thing about the historical record. It's kept by the people with power. And that is where the question of imagination came in. Because the one thing that an artist can do that a journalist or a researcher or a scientist cannot is engage in empathetic imagination. Because we're not bound to report only what we can verify. We can responsibly, having done as much research as we possibly can, imagine the perspectives that don't make it into the record. Imagine the particular realities of people whose particular experiences were erased and ignored. In order to do that, I went and spent a lot of time peering in windows of the colony. Spending time in this physical space. This is taken through the window of the colony chapel. It's the railing of one of the dormitories. I took all these photos. And ultimately, the poems that arose were an attempt to make particular what time and distance and a lack of power had anonymized. A poem can never, the persona poem can never stand in for the actual lived experience of someone. But what it can do is draw attention to the fact of their existence and the fact of their erasure and the fact of violence. And I want to end by acknowledging that it's really comfortable to talk about what's here and the history of American eugenics as if it is history, as if it belongs entirely to the past. But the truth is that eugenics are alive and well, and they're operational in so many of our systems. They're operational in our carceral system, which unfairly targets and penalizes people of color, people with disabilities, people who lack the resources granted to people in power, and in which, as recently as 2016, a judge was offering more lenient reduced sentences to offenders who would agree to get sterilized. As recently as 2015, more than 1,000 women were sterilized without their consent inside a California prison. And as recently as this year, hospitals were making decisions about who was worthy of COVID care based on their kind of body, their kind of health, the kind of life they were perceived to have lived. And this thought, we can blame our problems on this population. We can shut this population away. We can deny them their families, the capacity to have a family. And if we do that, our problems will get better. That's operational in our immigration policies. I point all of this out because one of the things that assignments around education will teach you is that everything is interconnected, that your artistic choices, your imaginative choices, your social choices are political choices. And that one of the gifts and privileges you have as a recipient of that education is an awareness of that fact and the capacity to make choices to create a better world. And that might look like activist action, it might look like scientific research, it might look like a whole huge combination of things, and it might look like the collision between art and research. Toni Morrison has this quote from her Nobel lecture in 1993. "Stop thinking about saving your face. Think of our lives and tell us your particularized world. Make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. We will not blame you if your reach exceeds your grasp, if love so ignites your words they go down in flames and nothing is left but their skull. Or if, with the reticence of a surgeon's hands, your words suture only the places where blood might flow. We know you can never do it properly. Passion is never enough, neither is skill, but try." There is bravery in imagination, in being willing to take risks, in researching and thinking outside your comfort zone, in confronting your own privilege and the places where you lack it, of making your own world, your own experience particular and legible for someone else, and of acknowledging that other people's lives, whether they're lived alongside you or before you or after you, are just as particular and real as you are. You'll notice that that sign on the door of the Colony building says "No trespassing." And I'm going to end tonight by reminding you, again, not that I'm advocating breaking into a house, but that trespassing against the limits of what you know, trespassing against what is expected of you, trespassing against people in power, trespassing against your own sense of your failures or limitations, trespassing against what is usual, what is already known, and what feels safe, is the path toward progress. I hope you all do an immense amount of intellectual, artistic, creative trespassing in your time here. Stop thinking about saving your face and just try.
You have some time for questions. If anyone has questions for Molly?
Oh, I see hands already.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, Jennifer?
Okay, so just two rapid fire questions. One, I've noticed that, and I'm sure you pointed out the multitude of voices of the poem. How many of them did you really think of and develop in your collection? Two, I noticed religion and God plays a large part in the collection. Is there a particular reason for that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm just going to repeat the question in case it's back in here. So 2 questions about the development of the voices and then the place of God in your work in the poem.
Yeah. So you're right to notice several voices, and I would say anybody who's reading those poems paying attention to form might notice 3 forms that occur a lot over the course of the collection. There are those poems that end in a kind of triptych of definitions. There are the poems that have those italicized stanzas that float in the middle. They're all in tercets. And then there are the poems that lack punctuation and have all those spaces in the middle of the line, which are what we call caesuras, right? And for me, those forms really represent the 3 dominant patient voices that are in the book. And if you pay attention to them, I think you'll start to notice perspectives reoccurring. But it was really important to me to also have poems in the voices of staff. Particularly because I think it's really easy to look back on periods of history that we now see as atrocious, right? And think, those were perpetrated by monsters, right? People who are nothing like me or anyone I love or anyone who's alive right now. And it's really easy to safely consign them to the past. But it was interesting for me to think about, for instance, the fact that the height of the sterilization movement coincided with the height of the Depression, right? And the resource anxiety, the sense that there wasn't enough in the world, is part of what perpetrated the rapid growth of the eugenics movement. Again, maybe sounds a whole lot like the way we talk about there aren't enough jobs, there isn't enough money, there's people coming into our country. And so it was really important to me to explore that. And the nuance, the fact that these monstrous things were being perpetrated by people who were flawed and fearful and made monstrous by their own fear. And the other thing, you note that there are a lot of poems about God in the book. And some of that is because I'm interested in religion and have a sort of fraught and evolving relationship with faith. But also it's because in this really small collection of individual buildings that I got to see in the colony, where it was mostly like there were dormitories, there was a hospital, there were administrative buildings, and that was pretty much it. There was also a chapel. And that was bananas to me, because I thought, hey, what would it be like to have faith if you were a patient in this place, an inmate, which is what they called them? And how would you square that? And then also, how would you square faith if you were a person working in this place, perpetrating these sterilizations? That was fascinating to me, that in this, the explosion of this kind of science, and I'm using quotes here, there was also this literal, physical making space for faith. And so the book is really interested in trying to sort of wrestle with that complexity because, again, what did it mean that there was literally a chapel? It's a great question. Yeah, second one. Yeah. Let's start with one, just so that other people have and then I'm also happy to hang out for a minute after this and
Well, was the question really interested in the blinder section?
Yeah.
Especially just like, how did you prepare yourself to write that section? How did you make it feel so like swimming through your...
So the question was how about writing the blind room section and preparing yourself for that.
Yeah, that was the hardest section in the book to write. For those of you who are maybe not as familiar with the text, the blind room was the colony's term for solitary confinement, which we can talk about all the loadedness of that, of using the term the blind room, right? Which was a term that I came across in a newspaper article written in the 1970s about the colony. And the way that I prepared myself to write it was by doing it in between other sections so that I wasn't just trying to grapple with all of those poems at once. But also in understanding that I had taken on a responsibility by writing this text and I couldn't shy away from the parts of it that were the hardest and the ugliest. I really ended up feeling as I was working on this book that because I was telling a story that wasn't my own, and because I was telling a story that I had had so little prior knowledge of, and that I was coming to realize so many people had so little prior knowledge of, I was really responsible to the people, and in particular the women, who had been sterilized, who had been assaulted, who had been victimized, and that needed to show up. And then in terms of picking the poems particular, you'll notice that there are a lot of poems that have a lot of echoes in them, lines that repeat, moments where you think you're going to get the same poem and then it turns on its head. And some of that is to produce the sense of claustrophobia, right, that would have existed in that space. And one of my favorite parts of being a poet, and if this were a poetics lecture, I would talk about this endlessly, is that you can use form to do emotional work, right? We tend to think about it as this decision of artifice, right? I'm going to break a line here because it looks good, or I'm going to try to write in meter because that's how poems are supposed to go. But in actuality, form is a tool, right? It's how we produce the body of the poem on the page and the feeling of the poem for the reader. Yeah. Yeah, in the orange.
What do you think is the most effective way to combat modern eugenicists like Peter Singer?
I think, and this is going to seem sort of at first blush like an annoyingly pat answer, but I think that the counter to discrimination, to violence, to hate, is always knowledge and empathy, right? It's always information and particularity. And I think that doing work that continues to try to make as many people as possible aware that this is still going on, aware of just why it is so damaging and harmful, aware of their own capability to behave differently and to combat it, and then also that figures out how to couple that awareness with the evocation of particular human experience, right? There's that really over-quoted fact, right? One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic, right? We make that mistake all the time as human beings. Numbers get large. Injustices get vague. Conversations get theoretical, and we forget the fact that humanity is at the bottom of every single one of them. And I believe that, like with combating other kinds of violence, other kinds of prejudice, one prong is never going to be enough, right? We need reform at the political level. We need information at the level of education. We need art. We need activism. We need you all to go do the different and wildly specific things that you are going to go do, and whether or not you see yourself as actively working to combat injustice, to understand that whatever you are doing affects that, that's how change gets made. Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. So I'm on the autism spectrum. And I was curious about like how many, I mean obviously you don't know like the exact number, and I'm not asking for numbers, I don't like numbers anyways.
Fair enough.
Were there a lot of people who were on the autism spectrum or some sort of neurodivergent? I mean, I'm guessing there were a lot of people who were that were in the colony.
Yeah, absolutely. So those terms, imbecilic, idiotic, feeble-minded, those were the medical terms of the time, but because our understanding of disability, of neurodivergence, of difference was not nuanced, there were all kinds of people who ended up underneath those umbrellas, right? And anyone who behaved in ways that seemed odd, seemed threatening, seemed off, even seemed sexually promiscuous, ended up in often places like the colony. And so while I can't give you a number, partly because nobody used terms, right, like autistic at the time, I can say with great certainty that absolutely the people who were neurodivergent absolutely ended up in the colony. And again, I should say that, this book, again, is about the particular and the localized in this particular institution, but there were institutions like this all over the country.
I would say that a lot of the poems come from female perspectives and of female patients. Could you speak to why that is?
Yeah, there are a couple of answers. That's a great question. So she was saying that many, if not all of the poems in the book seem to come from female perspectives, and she was asking about why that is. There are sort of two answers to that question, one of which is maybe slightly more thoughtful, and one of which is just about my own limitations. When you take on an artistic project, one thing you have to do is you have to figure out how to put boundaries on it, right? Limitations on it, because otherwise you would just, every book, everything would just end up being, it would have to be 1 million pages long and you could never finish it, right? We, as artists, we put artificial delineations around things, right? And one of the delineations that I put around the book is all the poems from the point of view of patients were going to come from women. And that, it was true for a couple of reasons. One is that women were sterilized in greater numbers than men, even though men were also sterilized. The second is honestly really blatantly, and eugenics still disproportionately affects women. or people with female presenting bodies, frankly. The other reason is that I am a woman, right? And I already knew that I was pushing the limits of my imagination, right? To ventriloquize and vocalize into these experiences. And I was aware of the limits of what I could do, right? And that it was much easier for me to do that kind of, again, what I'm calling empathetic researched imagination into the experiences of women than it would be for me to do it into the experiences of men, as if that's one of the sort of boundaries that I put on the book. But it does try to acknowledge, in a variety of ways, the presence of men in the colony, right? Both staff and patients. Thank you for that.
In the back row or something?
So there's one poem where you talk about how people like went into surgery not knowing that like the light in their windows would never come back on. In that I was kind of confused on whether you were talking about sterilization or lobotomies or like both, or like what exactly you were referencing.
Yeah, so that was a question about, there's a line in the poems about people going into surgery and not understanding that the light in their windows would never come back on. I think probably what I had front of mind was sterilizations, and just the notion that they would be changed in some fundamental way that they didn't have, that something would have been taken from them, right, that they didn't know about and didn't have language for. But certainly there were other kinds of deeply invasive, like surgical procedures for psychiatric care that happened at the time. Lobotomies were one of them, and I think it's wonderful and acute to read that resonance also into the text. Also, I miss it here, and I love being a place where people read so carefully and can quote lines back to you. It's fabulous.
Yeah, we'll run the side.
On your series of Where Are You Now poems, I was wondering what your inspiration was for writing those poems in each section, and also that during In the Field you wrote 2 of these poems into this section, and I was wondering what was the statement behind that supposed to entail?
Thank you for that. So she's asking about, every section in the book begins with a poem called Where You Are, that is a sort of description of the collision between the physical place and the emotional tenor of the space itself. And one entry that's sort of what I was thinking about, and then there's one section that has 2 of them, if she was interested in that. So one thing, I talked to you guys a little bit about the fact that, because there were limits of what I could find in the archive, in the record, one of the most meaningful kinds of research that I did for this book was going and spending time in the physical space of the colony, right? And of those buildings. And I wanted to, that time in the physical space and the existence of these physical spaces and the texture of these physical spaces that remained even after so many years had passed was so moving to me and so meaningful to me that I wanted to find some way to transfer at least a modicum of that to the reader, right? To give them a sense of being located in this physical place. And so, if any of you have ever been to like an amusement park or a museum or like even like a very large shopping mall, you will notice those maps that are often everywhere that are sort of maps of the place, and then there's a little arrow that says you are here, right? And locates you in the sort of maze. And I was thinking about that and thinking about sort of how do I locate the reader, right? How do I orient the reader physically and emotionally in where they are? And so yeah, each of the poems begins in that way with a poem called Where You Are. And then the one section has 2 because I was thinking about the way that time passes, right, and the ways that places change, and also that where you are at one moment in your life might not be where you are in another moment, and where you are in relationship to something might change, and also where you are would change as time passes. A place in the evening is not the same as that place in the morning. A place in the winter is not the same as that place in the fall. So I wanted to have at least one section where this poem's gestured at that capacity for change and transformation. Oh man. Okay, black tank top, and then we'll do a brown t-shirt.
Okay, so how did it feel to be there? Like,
How did it feel to be there? Is that what you were asking? It felt moving and strange and sometimes rage-inducing and sometimes grief-inducing. I took a lot of trips to that place over a long time, and in sort of in the way that I was just saying, it changed, you know, what felt particularly resonant to me, what felt particularly difficult, what felt particularly important, sometimes changed, but I always felt a sort of magnetic pull toward that place and toward the project, and it was one of the going there, returning there to that physical space was one of the things that I did and that I think kept me sort of going, even when the project felt incredibly hard, because it just reminded me of the real presence of all of this history and all of this violence and the importance of bringing some of it to light. And I will say, one of the sort of earliest things I did, it was the first time after the start of the pandemic. It was like the first time I'd left the house or gone into the world in like a month. In April of 2020, right after what was then the Central Greenway Training Center finally shut its doors and transferred its last patient out, I went back to the colony one more time because I was worried that they were going to bulldoze it. And that it would, you know, just become something else, and that is, I think, what is going to happen. And so I wanted to make sure that I saw a lot of the pictures that I showed you guys that were taken during that final trip. And it was really moving and difficult, and I might tear up thinking about it. I mean, it's really one thing many of you will learn when you begin to undertake projects that become the work of your life, whatever shape they take, is it really just becomes core to who you are and how you move through the world. The book was published more than 5 years ago now, and I would say I talk about it in spaces like this, in book clubs, in rooms of doctors, in two groups of my own students, probably almost once a week, and have for the last 5+ years, and have been living with this project now for more than a decade, since the very first time I saw the colony. And so it's really foundational to the way I think about the work of my life. Thank you for that. Brown t-shirt, and then in the back.
I like what you were saying about how all thought and all art is political, and how no matter what we're doing, we're making some statement. So what was it for you when you decided that poetry is how you want to do yours?
So it's funny because I think I picked poetry long before I had any cognizance of that conviction. Or really, I should say, even though this is the kind of woo-woo thing that I would probably roll my eyes if I heard someone else say, that poetry picked me. Brendan can tell you that even as a student here, I was 100% sure that that was what I wanted to do and was going to do. And really, I have been sure of that since elementary school. And I have no rational explanation for it other than that when I was 8 years old, I discovered a copy of Emily Dickinson's collected poems in my parents' bedroom and read, "The soul has moments of escape when bursting all the doors, she dances like a bomb abroad and swings upon the hours." And I had no idea what the fuck that meant. But it was, I heard something in the music of it, the magic of it, the compression of it, the strangeness of it. And I thought, that thing, I want to do that thing. I tell you now, as someone who's been writing and living as a poet for a long time, that one of the things that I appreciate about poetry is the ways that it makes space for both the fragment and the whole, and the ways that space and silence often say as much as language itself, which is something that I think is just really true about the world. The gaps, the chasms, the things that don't make it into the record, the things that aren't said, the things that aren't granted space are often as important as the things that are, if not more. And I love about a poem that it's this kind of negotiation always between silence and sound, between space and occupation. And it made it feel particularly suited to a project like this, right? That was about sort of attempting to gesture at this chasm in the record, while acknowledging that it could never fill it in.
I can attest that Molly was always a poet. Often her attitude was, why are you asking me to do this?
It's not a poem. But I will say that I hope one of the takeaways from this talk is that even the things that are not the thing you think you want to do, even the things that are not the thing that you expect, will often feed the thing that you end up doing. The ways I had to learn to write a research paper, the ways I had to learn to do research, the things I learned about neurology and medicine, the osteology class I took here when I was a sophomore on the bones in the body, all of those things ended up being really foundational to my work, even if I was really grumpy about like 30% of them when I was a student. Yeah, in the mustard color, I think you're in the shadows a little bit.
You mentioned you have had sort of like a evolving relationship with faith.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious how, if it did at all, your relationship to faith changed as you undertook this project and onward.
Yeah, it's funny.
I'm going to repeat that, just about whether the evolving relationship with faith had anything to do with this project or evolved along with it.
Yeah, I think it absolutely did, and it's funny to me that I've actually never thought about quite how to articulate it. I think maybe it has to do with that sense of having been tied to this large population of people, that even though there was so much about the project that made faith feel stupider and farther away, right? How can you have faith in a world where this kind of violence happens, this kind of horror happens, this kind of cruelty happens? It was also a project that felt so faded, and it affirmed for me in a way that I had never really been able to articulate just how integral my identity as a person with disability was to my life. And that in some ways felt affirming of this notion that there is something bigger than each of us individually, even if I have a complicated sense of what it is. I will say that part of what I tend to refer to as my inability to get away from God has to do with the fact that I was an identical twin. She died when we were infants, and so I've always sort of felt her loss and her presence, and that has always sort of meant that I'm like, okay, there has to be something beyond like what's very obvious here in front of us. And I think that in some ways poetry is often the way that I'm trying to articulate that shift, that gap, that magic, the weirdness of feeling both certain of something beyond this life we're living and also so sure that it can't be easily explained by any single one path.
We've got time for one more question, I think.
Oh, I don't want to pick. You have to pick the last person because I feel sad about having to leave people with their hands up.
Okay, maybe two more.
Yes. So I am very interested in researching stories like the ones talked about in this books, and I also have a lot of physical and mental disabilities, and I also have Tourette's. So I was wondering if there were any cases of people who also had Tourette's that were institutionalized, because I don't really think I recall reading about any of them, but I just want to know if they're...
Yeah, I feel 100% certain that there were people who had Tourette's syndrome that were institutionalized, and in fact, one of the reasons that epilepsy was one of the, it's in the title of the institution, it's in the title of the book, and it represented a huge and significant population of the percentage of people who were sterilized, is because it freaked people out because people, quote unquote, looked normal, seemed normal, and then they would have seizures, right? They would have these involuntary movements, they would have these what were at the time just called episodes, right? And people were like, what the hell, why is that happening? That's strange and frightening. And other kinds of involuntary neurological responses were absolutely sort of caught up underneath that umbrella. I can't off the top of my head point to one particular story, but I can absolutely guarantee that if you searched the image archive on eugenics, you would get results about that, and I think that would be that's a wonderful and important place to go digging. And Brendan can definitely pass along my contact information, and I'm super happy to talk to you about it more and guide you along in that journey.
Hi.
So, the Toni Morrison quote from earlier, you know you can never do it properly, passion is never enough, neither skill but try.
Yeah.
I can only imagine that in that, at least personally, I would have just a ton of fear. Like that's probably terrifying. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I will say my biggest fear was that I would do this wrong, or I would do it in some way that when what I wanted to be was constructive, right, and empathetic and careful and generative would in fact do damage, right, or sort of double down on the violence that had happened. And honestly, I think some measure of that kind of fear is good because it keeps you careful, right? It keeps you responsible, it keeps you tuned in, and it keeps you humble, right? All of which I think is really important, especially to doing work like this, right? Where you are dealing with experiences that are not your own, you are dealing with an immense amount of information, and getting things right is important. But the other thing that I ultimately had to believe, and you have to be able to access just like a little tiny bit, just like a little tiny bit of like bombastic pride. If you're going to be an artist, you have to be able to tap in to some version of yourself that believes I'm the right person to tell this story. I can do this, and I think cultivating a little bit of that, as long as you also keep the fear alive, is a really good thing. And and maybe it looks like reading work by yourself that you admire. Maybe it looks like reminding yourself of people you respect and trust who have affirmed your talent, your hard work, your intelligence, your capability, any of those things. But I will also say that being afraid and doing things anyway is key, right? And the thing I ultimately kept telling myself is, right now, there's nothing. Right now, this is just silence, and it's just this chasm. I have to try, right?
Thank you so much, Molly. Thanks for coming back to Simon's Rock.
Thanks for all.